Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you may be, and welcome to the PATA Annual Summit 2021 Forum under the theme Reflect, Reconnect, and Revive. We have, like I said this morning, we have a fantastic lineup of speakers ahead this afternoon. Really, CEOs from TripAdvisor, Agoda, WeGo, the CEO of South African Tourism Board, CEO of Dubai Airports, the president of Emirates. I mean, I can go on and on. It's really a fantastic lineup of speakers. So thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, or morning or evening, wherever you may be. First, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Paul Brangan. I am the Director of Communications and External Affairs at the Pacific Asia Travel Association, and I will be your host for this afternoon's forum. Before we get to the program, I do have a couple of technical notes I want to share with everyone here. Just a reminder, if you are on the web-based version, if you want to send a question, please use on the right-hand side of the screen. Please submit your questions there. You also use that to chat with the other delegates, say hello, where you're from, what you're doing, maybe thoughts about the current session, insights that you find very relevant to your particular line of work. So feel free to engage with the other delegates just using that function. So this is the web-based version. If you're on mobile, it's very similar. You'll see there's a session chat. You have to click on that. And again, you can submit any questions for the speakers. We'll get them over to the moderator to ask the speakers. And again, chat and say hello to your friends and other delegates who are watching today. I also wanted to point out at the top of your mobile screen, you can bookmark sessions. So you'll get a reminder for a session that you're really interested in watching maybe later today or tomorrow. So just bookmark that. You'll get a notification when that session's about to start. And so you won't forget and you'll be able to join us live to watch the session. So feel free to share all today's content over the next few days on social media, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, TikTok, wherever your choice is. Please use the hashtag PAS 2021, hashtag PATA Annual Summit, hashtag PATA Events, and hashtag I Found Rock. That's Ras Al Khaimah, our platinum sponsor for this year's summit, and also our host for next year's annual summit, which will be in person. So, as I said, the theme of this year's event is Reflect, Reconnect, and Revive. And session one is Reflects. And our keynote presentation will be on reflections on travel. Our keynote is the Group Executive Chairman and Managing Director of Shuntek Holdings, and she's also the co-chairperson, Executive Director of MGM China Holdings. She is very active in the tourism industry, holding many roles in different organizations, including executive committee member of WTTC and the executive chairman of the China Chamber of Commerce of Tourism. She is dedicated to the promotion of global tourism development and plays active roles in leading tourism organizations around the world. And of course, she's also the vice chairman and secretary general of the Global Tourism Economy Forum, our gold sponsor for this year's event. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Pansy Ho. Sorry, let me stop sharing.
Good afternoon. I am delighted to open the first session of PATA's annual summit and would like to express my gratitude to PATA for organizing the three-day event. Last year, international travel essentially came to a stop. Before the pandemic, the sector enjoyed and was heralded for its remarkable growth, with 1.5 billion travelers crossing international borders in 2019. Future growth seemed both unstoppable and inevitable. But the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic has caused many of us in the industry to take a pause, to reflect on what was working and what wasn't working, and to rethink approaches to business and development as the sector reconfigures and ultimately returns. The pandemic has impacted nearly every tourist destination around the world in some way or another. Some have been devastated, while others have been less affected or have been able to pivot and salvage the local tourism economy. As we reflect on what has worked in the past year, one theme stands out: cooperation, particularly between the private and public sector. While many destinations have accelerated private-public partnerships in response to the crisis, they were already inherent to the economic structure of Macau and have been thus essential in Macau's success and its recovery. Tourism is the backbone of Macau's economy, with more than half of its economic input directly supported by the sector. In 2019, Macau welcomed 40 million visitors and a 10% increase from the previous year. As you can imagine, the pandemic had an immediate and drastic effect on visitor levels as borders and businesses were closed. Through the implementation of immediate, intensified health and hygiene protocols put in place to protect public health, Macau has had 0 cases of COVID-19. At the same time, extensive public-private partnerships and concession relationships were able to preserve employment, advance human capital, and ultimately resuscitate the economy. Macau's formula is the unique partnership between the government, the 6 integrated resort concessionaires, and the community. As the main employers in the city, concessionaires have a deep commitment to Macau and to its people. Despite experiencing monumental financial losses in the past year, concessionaires have seized the moment to come together, building upon their already established commitment to Macau, and have worked hand in hand with the government to support the recovery of the economy and the livelihoods of the Macanese. The primary objective in these efforts was to put people first. Concessionaires offered direct financial assistance to those affected by the crisis, donated personal protective equipment, and supported local SMEs by offering rent-free periods for retail tenants. Another central theme of these efforts was to invest in human capital and to preserve employment. With the unprecedented closing of casinos last year, concessionaires offered their workforces paid leave, ensuring both the safety and the incomes of employees. They also took the opportunity to enhance training and education for employees. For example, at MGM China, we offered 6,500 e-learning courses through MGM Academy in practical areas such as hotel operations, customer service, and food safety. Over 4,000 team members signed up for the trainings through a mobile app and were able to learn and train freely, even when they were off property. Special programs were created to engage locals in the inner workings of the tourism industry. Facilitated by private-public partnerships, the government launched the Macau Ready Go e-platform, which invited local residents to join tours around the city. These tours not only encouraged new levels of domestic tourism, but also succeeded in turning local residents into ambassadors for their city and for the local tourism industry. These and other efforts, which demonstrates the strong commitment of Macau's key tourism players and their sacred bond with the government and the people, have played a critical role in maintaining and renewing confidence in Macau's future. In September 2020, cross-border travel between mainland China and Macau resumed. With no COVID cases and the reopening of the economy, the Macau government expects nearly 10 million visitors for 2021. Ultimately, the example of Macau demonstrates that tourism's recovery depends on unity, the resilience of the global tourism economy hinges on corporations stepping up to be reliable partners with the public sector, creating a dialogue and working together towards a common goal. On the consumer side, this year has not only lent itself to reflection on the value of tourism to destinations, it has also led us to reflect on the values of today's travelers. New travel trends and consumer preferences fueled by the pandemic may ultimately reshape the tourism landscape. Tourism has evolved. There may be no going back to normal. Today, travelers are progressively favoring authentic travel. After a year or more of not traveling, more people are seeking life-affirming experiences. A strategic focus in Macau for 2021 is the concept of Tourism Plus, which aims to merge tourism with other industries in order to boost and diversify the tourism economy and enrich the tourism experience. Diversification and integration with other industries such as sports, wellness, and culture will open up new avenues to combat seasonality, promote dispersion, and cultivate competitive strengths. With its spectacular beaches, parks, creative industries, and UNESCO-recognized gastronomy, Macau has the opportunity to expand tourism resources and showcase all that it has to offer. A competitive and resilient global tourism economy will rely not only on cooperation and improved dialogue between the private and public sector, but also on the realization of cross-sectoral partnerships that result in high-quality and sustainable tourism development. I would again like to congratulate PARTA for the organization of the summit and offer my appreciation for this year's theme, Reflect, Reconnect, and Revive. I hope you all enjoy fruitful discussions on these ideas as we consider a better future. Thank you.
Very much, Pansy. It's really actually really great to hear about all the work that Macau has been doing to restart tourism and how much, how the government has been working with the private sector in that process. So we've come to so once again, thank you, Pansy. We've come to our second part of session 1, New Models of Tourism. And with that, moderating that session is the head of research and insight at MaShare USA, Ms. Rochelle Turner. Sorry, MaShare is a sustainable design firm, a B Corp, and a signatory and participant in the United Nations Global Compact. Before joining MaShare, hope I'm pronouncing that right, Rochelle was the VP of Research and Sustainability at the World Travel and Tourism Council. So I will turn this over to Rochelle. Rochelle, stage is all yours. You're still on mute? I think you just got to get off
Thanks,
mute.
Paul, and thanks to PATA. And yes, still getting used to this Zoom world that we're all in. Nearly all countries of the world have made some serious promises to each other of what we would achieve by 2030. We thought we have to be on a path to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 1.5 degrees below pre-industrial levels. We promised that we would achieve 17 sustainable development goals, of which the tourism industry is directly mentioned in 3 of them. Goal 8 around decent work and economic growth, Goal 12 around sustainable consumption and production, and Goal 14, life underwater. 2030 is only 9 years away. So prior to the pandemic, international arrivals had increased by 250% in the last 2 decades, and tourism represented 10.3% of global GDP, and 1 in 10 jobs was either directly or indirectly related to travel and tourism. For the last 12 months, though, tourism has been on pause and our activities have been on hold. So as we now enter this recovery mode, we have many voices calling for a rethink on how we grow resilience, on how we rebuild in a far more sustainable manner, and how we reinvent the industry to one that ensures both lower emissions on the one hand and greater purpose on the other. So I have some really wonderful people with me today virtually, and I'm excited to hear their thoughts on how new models of tourism might play out in the years and months ahead. So we have Alain Duprat, head of the Regional Development and Tourism Division at the OECD, John Perrottet, the Global Tourism Specialist at the World Bank, and Lauren Uppink-Calderwood, head of Aviation, Travel and Tourism Industries at the World Economic Forum. So welcome, good morning, good evening to you. I know, John, it's 2 o'clock in the morning where you are in Washington, DC. So thank you very, very much for being with us today. My first question to all of you, I guess, is this question which started with an if. The question we've been given, if the industry must adapt and evolve, what new models may we consider? So let's start with that first of all. Is it your belief that this is indeed the case and that the industry really does need to change? And if so, where is that change needed most? John, given it's 2 o'clock in the morning, I think I'll start with you.
Well, thanks very much, Rochelle. It's not only about me. Lauren's also, I think, on the same time zone. So,
oh, is she? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, we all try to keep each other awake here. But listen, thanks so much for this question. And I think what you're getting at is, what do we really need to do? And as the World Bank, obviously our focus is very much on the developing world. This is why the bank is involved in tourism at all, is because we think that, this is a sector that can generate very substantial economic growth and alleviate poverty through that process. It's not about the tourism, it's about the poverty, in fact. Now, obviously, you mentioned earlier that there's been this phenomenal visitor growth. Why should the World Bank be interested in an industry that prior to COVID was doing so well? Well, the story is that it's not doing so well in many places. These benefits that are potentially being generated by the sector are just not getting to the people that could be that need them, to be frank. And why would that be? And I think Pansy's presentation earlier today touched on a number of these sort of underlying weaknesses that have been thrown up by the industry. And of course, in our world of the World Bank, we see this every day. We're dealing with clients every day that are struggling to make their tourism industries work efficiently, and they're up against a lot of challenges. And we know what many of them are. You've touched on some of them: poor environmental, sustainability. There's a low diversification in some of these countries. Some countries have extremely high dependence on tourism. And our own analysis during COVID has shown not only have those countries got a higher dependence, many of them have got very low resilience. We've used some of Lauren's data to try to analyse what this resilience index might look like for some countries, and it's pretty frightening. And so this whole question of resilience takes on a totally different picture in the COVID environment. In previous crises, it's largely about supply. Something happens where the supply side collapses for some reason. Here we have the exact opposite. We've got both supply and demand collapsed. So these underlying weaknesses, by the way, they're not new, okay? I think what's come out of this crisis is that they're just a lot more obvious and a lot more urgent. And I think now's the time to kind of look at how we can go about fixing that. And we've got lots of initiatives that we're seeing underway around the world, many of them dealing with some of these new financial models. We can touch on those in a moment if you like. But also, I think Pansy mentioned something very important, and that's this question of collaboration. We see in our client countries, very low levels in many respects of cooperation, collaboration, and effective implementation of tourism policy. It's not about bad policy. There's plenty of good policy, but just the mechanics of getting it done is where the challenges are. And this is where our institution often finds ourselves working pretty much at the coalface. It's not rocket science, to be frank, but it does require a much more serious level, I think, of commitment and prioritization. And we're now starting to see that, in fact, as a result of what we've seen in the last 12 months.
Thanks, John. So just picking up on that policy angle, I mean, Alain, your organization, OECD, is very involved in helping guide and create and understand policy that takes place in many parts of the world. So where are you seeing that impetus to drive the change, to create the policies, to take your ideas and get them implemented into the countries around the world?
Thank you, Rochelle. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. Yes, I think very much. I mean, the OECD is very much still trying to analyze the short-term and the long-term impact of the crisis to really understand what needs to be done to make the tourism economy more resilient. So many OECD governments and beyond are really trying to see where action is needed and how they could work better with the private sector, with the various parts of the industry to, as John was saying, also to look at some of the structural well-known weaknesses of the sectors. So, and all of them are well-known. But what we have seen also with the crisis is the fact that many governments, in fact, and many industry were not prepared, for a crisis of that scale. Certainly, we are, as I said, we are still very much trying to analyze this, but very much we are seeing also the crisis as a sort of bracket, an opportunity to rethink a little bit tourism for the future and to accelerate, for instance, the transition of the tourism economy, for instance, to a greener tourism business model, because there is these days, as we all know, a lot of public money, supporting the industry, and this is very welcome. And this will continue in many regions in the years to come. So it's also our joint responsibility to make sure that this public money is also used at best to support the transformation of the tourism economy, and in particular, I would say the green and the digital transformation of the tourism economy. Because certainly what the crisis has been showing is that, all parts of the tourism value chains are very, very interdependent, and this is true for aviation, this is true for a small hotel or a small restaurant. So we need to work together as an industry, we need to work together as government, but we also need to improve international coordination. There has been tremendous discussion about the lack of international coordination, in particular to support safe international mobility. OECD and many other organizations are working on these issues with ICAO and so on. And here there is a crucial need to do better. So very much what we are trying to push these days is to work closer with the industry to push for innovative practices, that will make the tourism industry more resilient, as John was saying. And this is a real challenge for policymakers at all levels. And here, I think, we will maybe discuss this a bit later. This is what we would call multi-level governance. And this is a critical issue, I think, for the tourism sector, because it's not only the central state, the national state, but it's also the region, the cities, the local communities. So how can we make all these policies going into the same direction? How can we have a better understanding of the tourism value chains and where the opportunities are? So just to say that many destinations at national, regional, or local level are on the move, and they're already, challenging the industry and putting some incentive for businesses in order to make sure that this public money that I was speaking about is really maximizing, I would say, the transformation of the tourism economy.
Thanks, Alain. Lauren, it's lovely to see you. I didn't realize you were in New York. I thought you might be in Switzerland. So, so thank you for staying up so late and being here with us. One of the things that Alain's that's touched on is around the innovative practices and the money that's available for business. And I suppose over the last few years, we've seen how businesses cannot exist on depleting its resource base, nor at the same time can it make money if society is shut down. And some of these new models of business are going to involve change. And that might involve greater involvement from stakeholders rather than shareholders. The company I work for, Mashare, is a B Corp. We're one of only about 4,000 in the world. So it's a tiny movement. But this sort of movement towards stakeholder capitalism, is this something, or are there other changes that can be led by business to help create what the world we need for the future?
Absolutely. And I think what my fellow panelists have touched on as well is that prior to the pandemic, within travel and tourism itself, there was a concern that eventually we would be cannibalizing our own resources, right? That competitiveness based on pure growth and visitor numbers was not sufficient, and that we needed to develop better systems for both measuring the impact of tourism on destinations and communities and ecosystems. And we were already looking at that with the Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Report 2 years ago, saying, is this the adequate way of measuring competitiveness of the industry? That being said, outside of the travel and tourism industry, I wouldn't say it's this industry alone. There is certainly a push towards stakeholder capitalism, but an understanding that not only do businesses have more responsibility to all those with whom they intersect, but also that their customers are demanding something different. And if they don't adapt, that will be that'll impact on their ability to provide services and goods to their customers. And so we're certainly seeing across the board and across the value chain this push for not only greater sustainability of the businesses themselves, but the way in which they do business with the other stakeholders, and that ultimately has an impact on how they interact with different stakeholders at a national, regional, and local level. I think what's been clear from the pandemic, and again, my fellow panelists have spoken to this, is the interconnectedness, not just between different states and businesses, but just between all the different stakeholders. And I think large business in particular, and Rochelle, you and I've had conversations about this before, that the travel and tourism industry is not only made up of large global businesses, but of many much smaller organizations that are heavily dependent on travel and tourism for their long-term sustainability. And I think large corporations, many of which have had ways in which to survive through the pandemic, need to think carefully about how they can support the rest of the value chain on which it is also dependent. And in terms of digital transformation, as you say, innovation, I think the crisis has only accelerated the need to evolve in that regard. And here will be increasing need for large corporations that are able to adapt much more quickly and pivot to be able to collaborate with both government and other smaller enterprises in the value chain.
One of the things that you've all talked about is this need for multi-level governance, for collaboration, for working together. And one of the new models that I've seen that really quite intrigues me is an approach that integrates policy, industry, community, so that tourism is pursued within the wider context of economic development and with cooperation from industry and communities. And I'm thinking largely about what Amsterdam is doing and how it's sort of fighting back, or at least the news says is it's fighting back against its excesses by using the Kate Wayworth's donut economic theory. So what needs to change for an approach, whether that be donut or not, but where destinations do allow this multi-level governance and can be sustainable by design rather than by exception, in order for that to work in all parts of the world? Or perhaps it can't yet work in all parts of the world because the governance isn't yet strong enough. What are your thoughts on that? Alain, do you want to take that one on first?
Sure. Please, no. As I said, I think this issue of governance and multi-level governance and what effective governance is has not been sufficiently discussed, analyzed in a field like tourism. You know, at the OECD, we are working on. I'm also in charge, for instance, of regional policy issues, and here multi-level governance is a central discussion. So I think we need to push this discussion. That's my first point. As I said, we need much more of an integrated policy, industry, community approach to support tourism and to look at tourism in the wider context, I would say, of city, regional, or economic development policies. There is clearly no one-size-fits-all solution, and all destination. And destination, in fact, what we have seen as are adopting a multiplicity of approaches. You mentioned Amsterdam, but there could be plenty of other cases of such multi-level governance. Of course, at the center of this discussion, you should put sustainability, for instance, at the center of the development. So what we are very much pushing at the OECD is what I would call an integrated approach to tourism, where various stakeholders, public and private, have a common vision, a common aim, which is about environmental sustainability, inclusiveness, diversification, innovation, prioritizing visitor management, for instance. And all of this can be really facilitated by bringing the various stakeholders at the table. So this is what is missing. This in itself will not be enough to determine the success. So it's also an ongoing, permanent process of discussion that should take place. But this is certainly what we are pushing, from the OECD.
Thank you. John, one of the things I wanted, a lot of the work of the World Bank is around funding for nature. And tourism has suffered, as we all know, extremely detrimentally this past year. But also the funding for nature. And I know that much of that funding did come from tourism. So from the financial markets, traditionally, one of the hardest things that we value is natural capital. And conservation has had the least in terms of investment over the years. And I know that's changing. We've recently heard about these rhino bonds, which I think are really interesting, or Bhutan for Life with investment to protect 70% of its green spaces. But what does the World Bank see as the best way forward for a sustainable approach to financing nature and in wild places, but given the context of tourism and some of the risks of an industry like tourism and clearly what we've been through over the last 12 months?
Sure. Look, thanks, Rochelle. I think this kind of links very much to what we've just been talking about. And Elaine mentioned this idea of an integrated governance. Tourism happens at a destination. It's not something that happens out there somewhere else. And so part of this new model needs to be to ensure that those destinations can, be more autonomous and become empowered to take control of what's going on in their location. Now, some of the ways to do that is through these sort of, what we call at the bank, these sort of articles or instruments of collaboration. In fact, we now use that term, whether it's a tourism plan that actually works as opposed to, most tourism plans that I've seen, to be frank, in my 30 years in this industry, I would put them in what I would say is the sort of aspirational kind of category. They're great ideas, really good, but have really no statutory impact. And now we're working in the bank with helping our clients develop tools that link the spatial planning at the destination to those aspirations to make sure neither of them are lost. And there are other tools, of course, which need to be done, but they need to be implemented. But they kind of can't be done without, some pretty serious government backing. There's no question that the public sector has to drive this. In Indonesia, we're doing this work now. These new master plans that we're preparing link the demand analysis with the spatial planning, with the aspirational designs for what the destinations wish to achieve themselves. But they come out at the other end proclaimed by the president through a decree. They have total statutory power, which is a big step forward. Now, if we move to the more salient point of your question, once we move to this question of how you manage destinations better, then the whole financing system needs to be looked at a little bit more differently. And this is what, to pick up on your point, what the bank is looking very closely at. How do we change the financing of tourism from a sort of enterprise-based model to a landscape or destination type model. It's not that this is new, by the way. There've been plenty of ideas of, using municipal bonds to finance convention centres. Why can't we use the same kind of financial instrument to look after SMEs that are at risk in a given destination, either because they've got no visitors or that they need to be prepared for when the visitors return? There are all sorts of tools like this. And I think the last few years, certainly since the Seychelles were the first to have the blue bond that the bank guaranteed back in 2016 or 17, I think it was, there's been a number of these initiatives now. There's no shortage of money, by the way. In fact, money is being mandated to be directed towards the protection of these landscapes and environments, be they terrestrial or marine, they're the same. And as a consequence, the trick here is to find the right instrument. And of course, I think this is still a bit of a work in progress, to be frank. There are a lot of people out there working on exactly how to do this. And the bank where I work, in fact, we're studying this quite in a lot of detail right now to ensure that the building blocks are in place to unleash those transactions. And what are the building blocks? Well, the first thing that you need is the way of measuring what is going to be the benefit. How do you measure whether it's biodiversity or some kind of carbon sequestration? What is the thing that is being measured? The second building block is some verification process for that to occur, because independent financiers, even if they're mandated, many of the big funds are mandated through their laws as a result of these various international agreements to put money into these investments, but they can't do that blindly. They have to be able to identify what it is that is going to deliver the dividend on their investment, and how do they know that they're going to get it. So they need this measurement and verification process, both of which need to be in place before we can actually monetize that process. Now, I think we're seeing some very exciting things happening in this space right now. I have a meeting almost every week now with various partners, government, private sector partners, fund managers, and landscape custodians, bringing those parties together to find those individual transaction solutions for them. So I can't give you the model right now because they vary from one place to another, but certainly in Africa, in Peru, in the Caribbean, we're working on all of these initiatives right now. So it's very exciting.
That sounds really exciting. And in terms of sort of the measurement side of it, Lauren, the competitiveness index that you've been working on in the WEF for so many years, how is that sort of changing and evolving as more information or different kinds of information becomes available for what investors need or what the world needs?
Yeah, thanks, Rochelle. I was hoping to be able to touch on this, because as you design even financial models, as John rightfully says, you need to understand what impact it will have, but also you need to understand the environment already. And so the Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Report has been, been used for over a decade, but we've recognized that some of the metrics that are being used there aren't necessarily indicative of this sort of future sustainable, sector of longevity. And so we're actually looking at how do we improve that framework. We're going through a very robust exercise at the moment with a number of our stakeholders, including those in the call, but to make sure that we are adequately measuring the impact of tourism in destinations. And so that means we're having to build in some of the metrics that measure things that may not have previously been considered relevant. And for example, resident sentiment. We saw before the crisis the risk of overcrowding in tourism destinations on communities and local fabric. The local fabric of the community, the fabric of the local community is crucial to a tourism experience. So how do we make sure that we're measuring the impact of tourists in these destinations? So not just only on natural assets, but those too are critical to include in such measurements, and many of which were in the existing competitiveness report. But again, number of assets is not enough. We need to know what are the policies in place that are protecting them, what is the investment into these, and what's the management, and how do you measure management of these places. And so certainly in terms of the framework of the competitiveness report, that's being adapted to address these issues. Another thing, however, you mentioned Amsterdam. Amsterdam's often used as an example here, but there's opportunity at these destinations for really meaningful public-private cooperation. And big businesses, especially as they've all become much more digitalized, have access to data sets that weren't previously available to us, and not necessarily only travel and tourism businesses. Mobile operators, etc., have data sets that can be very valuable to destinations in terms of how they manage tourism flows, how they understand the numbers, visitor numbers, etc. And so we're working with stakeholders from industry to see how we can unlock some of that data. Some of the things that you need are standardized ways for sharing that data that doesn't, give up trade secrets, but at the same time provides information that you can understand from across different sources, and there's a consistency. And so that, I think, is an area where we're going to have to work very closely together between public and private sector to unlock the value that can be there from the digital transformation.
Thanks. That's really exciting, actually, to see how the TTCI will evolve and change. I'm just conscious of time. I've got a couple more questions, but if anybody does have any questions that they want to ask, please put them in the chat or in the Q&A, and we'll get to them as soon as we can. One of the things that I've been really, quite astounded by, actually, is some of the changes that we've seen, whether they be technological changes or behavior changes, or even some of the policy changes recently. So, just as a result of this pandemic, we've seen France banning domestic flights that will be longer than 2.5 hours or 250 kilometers. The UK says it's going to cut emissions by 78% on 1990 levels, and importantly, are going to include aviation, international aviation, and shipping in those calculations. John, you've talked about some of the things around the blue bonds in Seychelles, but New Zealand has introduced a law requiring banks and investment managers to report on impacts of climate change on their business investments, and similar measures are coming from the EU. And then another really interesting one is, from Janet Yellen in the US, who's opened the debate about minimum levels of global corporate tax. What gives you all the most hope for a responsible and sustainable revival of travel and tourism? We've got lots of people saying, let's just get back, let's just get people flying again. But where is your hope coming from for the future in order to meet these 2030 targets? John, can we start with you on that one?
Sure, thanks, Rochelle. Well, look, I think tourism, has been traditionally a very resilient industry. I mean, there's no way you can run away from that sort of conclusion. So if you're asking me kind of where my hope is in the future, I think that's something I'd be relying on. But you just can't say that. Resilience needs to be sort of become much more part of the DNA. And we've had already some interesting discussions today about how to do that, what the pathways to that might be. At the bank, we kind of keep looking at this question from multiple angles, but we keep coming back to sort of one or two key questions. What's stayed the same, and what's changed? Well, a lot has changed, and what's stayed the same? And obviously, people's desire to travel is not changing. There'll be changes to the nature of the market and the way they, preferences for various types of activities. There's no doubt about that. But I think the underlying desire for people to travel is where you need to put your faith in the first place. The second thing is this resilience. Now, the question is how do we make that work better for people? But I think the other thing that I've noticed is, whilst we've touched today on some, very clear cases of a lack of coordination, what I'm seeing is a much stronger consensus around the fact that we do need to get some agreement about what this new tourism model looks like. And none of us have the answers. We're playing this very much by ear as we go along. We're all learning. I don't know of anyone that's doing forecasts yet of what's going to happen in the future. There's plenty of scenarios, but there's no forecasts. And when people ask us for that in the bank, we say, no, we're not going to do that. What we're going to do is try and work out what's the best way to work together to get around these kind of challenges that we have. And I think I do see an emerging consensus, at least certainly around the idea that we have to do this a lot better in the future. There are plenty of models. We heard Pansy, there is no shortage of good stories. Countries where tourism is well and truly integrated into the economy. The thing is, you don't hear too much about the bad news stories there, because those markets are working very efficiently. In the bank, we don't sort of tend to work on those economies much. So our focus is in the other places. But I do see a lot of consensus around this idea of doing this a lot better. We hosted an Aid for Trade conference recently. We had people from all sorts of countries, and I was quite surprised at just the level of agreement that people were expressed in that meeting about how to get together to solve some of these problems. So I'm very encouraged by that process. Let's see where that leads.
Lauren, you were nodding quite a lot at what John was saying. Is your hope coming from these, this focus on resilience, or is your hope coming from something perhaps more technological, or are there other areas where you think that we have the best chance of bringing the travel and tourism industry into something that will allow us to achieve our sustainable development goals?
I was certainly nodding in agreement that there has been an enormous amount of coordination amongst actors in this sector and into other sectors that are relevant, such as the healthcare sector, the tech sector. So absolutely in agreement there. I think it is absolutely accelerated the need for digitization. We've seen that with especially health passes and vaccine credentials, etc., which has really accelerated what was the transformation that was already happening in the industry around digital identity, etc., which I think the sooner we move on that, the better, but we need to find a way to make sure that that's transferable across economies. But I think what's given me a lot of hope is that the recognition of many large businesses that they need to be net zero by 2050. And we've seen that from, especially in the last couple of months, from the aviation sector, who previously, you mentioned that the UK have now included aviation and shipping in their emissions targets. Previously, aviation was sort of considered as one of the last that would need to transform. And I think it has the biggest footprint amongst the aviation, travel and tourism sector. And really, we've seen some great commitment from different airline bodies and airlines themselves, but also from corporate buyers of travel that are now saying, our footprint needs to be addressed, and we will do so in terms of contributing, for example, to buying sustainable aviation fuel. And so I think during the midst of a crisis that has impacted this sector much more than many others, we've really been at the forefront of the impact of the pandemic. It's given me a lot of hope to see that they are responding with optimism of the industry returning, but doing so in a way that takes into consideration their impact on the global economy and environment. Yeah.
So Alain, one of the things that we also hear is, though, if we are actually going to create the change we need to have something that is aligned to a paradigm shift. So we can't have the business as usual, and that many of the approaches that we've seen so far are not enough in terms of what we need to do in order to reach the 1.5 degree target, or even reach the sustainable development goals. And I know that the OECD has been looking at its Better Life Index as a way of measuring or moving beyond GDP. So stop just looking at the financial impact of how a country is performing and how the world is performing, but start building in measures around well-being. Is this Better Life Index from the OECD something that is gaining traction, and you see is something that actually could be that hope for how we revive our sector and our world going forward?
Yes, absolutely. I think we have been working on the Better Life Index for some years now, and what governments, what citizens, what different people like is very much that this is a tool for you to play with, so you can weight the various indicators and find your way to have a different perception of what makes our economy work. So I think the discussion there was very much to open minds and go beyond GDP, as you said, measurement. And what is true for the entire economy, I think is also very much true for tourism. So I think what we need now is really to kind of reconsider what makes success in tourism and the various perception of tourism success there. So the question of measurement in tourism is a complex issue. Tourism is difficult to measure. At the same time, tourism is a revenue economy, and tourism statistics are also revenue. The OECD, WEF, UNWTO, and many others have been working a lot on these issues. 20 years ago, as you know, Rochelle, we established the tourism satellite account, which is a very macroeconomic way to look at measurement. More recently, Lauren was speaking about the WEF, World Travel and Tourism, the Tourism Index. We also at the OECD have been looking at new ways to measure competitiveness, to measure tourism at subnational level. We are still trying to find our way. I think what we have been saying today is very true. I mean, let's put resilience, sustainability really at the center of recovery. And let's look together, you know, at the best indicator to monitor progress there. And this is not something that either the OECD or the WEF or the World Bank can find on their way. We need to coordinate also and to work closer together on these issues to see what are the best indicators. Just to rebound on what makes up, certainly on my side, I would just like to say one word. It's about the way governments are looking at tourism now. You know, I mean, I've been working at the OECD for some time. For many years, tourism was really not taken very seriously. Last year, we have been speaking about tourism, I mean, every day, you know, at the OECD, of course, because of the macroeconomic impact of tourism in many countries. And now I can see that a majority, I would say, of OECD members are definitely looking at tourism much more seriously and integrating tourism in economic policy. I think this will dramatically change the way we, governments, together with industry, we look and we build this industry in the near future. Because here I can see a complete change of positioning, you know, of our governments, and in particular of finance and economy ministries. And this will be key. And if it is, you know, combined with a strengthening of national and regional and local tourism administration, together with, as Lauren was saying, a real prise de conscience, you know, awareness, you know, of this net zero emission way. I think yes, I think we have a big opportunity for the coming years. I'm convinced about that.
Thank you, Alain. We're coming up to time. We just have one question, and maybe there's a very quick answer to this one question. This is from Joanna Marie Victorio. Thank you for your question. It's, how can tourism bubbles in the tourism industry help in the short to medium term? Is it going to make a difference in terms of getting around initially? John, did you want to answer that one?
Okay, thanks. Well, I think it will, and I think reopening is one thing we have learned in the last 6 months is reopening is about sequencing. You know, where are the places that you can reopen with risks that are managed? And we've seen plenty of places where those risks have not been well managed at all. So I think bubbles create an opportunity for you to think about, you know, where you might reopen and under what conditions and in what sequence. For example, the bubbles that are going on in the South Pacific area, Australia, New Zealand, you know, they've been looked at from the point of view of, you know, what are the classifications of groups that present the lower risk that would enable, that could take advantage of travel before the general public, so to speak. It also gives the opportunity to test protocols between bilateral partners and in some cases trilateral partners in a wider group. So I think they've got a lot of potential. It's a lot easier to get agreement between a couple of countries than it is to get, you know, the whole globe to agree on aviation protocols. We're in a bit of a mess in relation to that right now. And so I think they do have a future.
Great, thanks. I think we're just coming up to time. Lauren, I don't know if you had another word you wanted to say on that. I know that the WEF has been working really hard now.
Sure. No, I think the bubbles do obviously help, and I think, as John says, the sequencing is key. But at the end of the day, we have to take a risk-based approach, and we need to encourage countries to do so. And taking blanket measures aren't useful. So testing out through bubbles and gradually opening will be the only way to really move forward at this point.
Great, thank you. So we're at time. I really would like to thank PATA for organizing this event, and then thank my wonderful panelists, John Paratet from the World Bank, Lauren Upping-Calderwood from the World Economic Forum, and Alain Duprat from OECD. Thank you very much, particularly as it's so late now in New York and Washington. So have a good night's sleep, and thank you again. Good
Thanks,
to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Rochelle. You did a fantastic job. Really, it's a very, very interesting discussion. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, John. Thank you, Elaine. And, thank you so much for those of you in the US who stayed up this late to join us. It's greatly appreciated. Thank you so much. I'll let you guys all get some rest now, get a good night's sleep. For those of you in the middle of the evening, and for those of you in the afternoon, well, I guess, enjoy the rest of your day. And I'll just do a quick wrap up here of this session. Thanks, John. So once again, thank you to all of our speakers and our moderator, John, Elaine, Rochelle, and Lauren. Really, thank you for taking the time out of your day or staying up really late at night, and really providing some really great insight in terms of new models of tourism that we should consider moving forward. It's as Pansy had said, it's really this public-private partnership where we'll be able to work together and then actually recover and revive the industry moving forward. Without the work of everyone working together in unison, this might not happen. It might be staggered. It might be uneven. So really, it's great to hear the different viewpoints. Great to hear from Pansy as well. And with that, I'd like to just end this session with a thank you again to all of our sponsors, the Ras Al Khaimah Tourism Development Authority, our platinum sponsor, gold sponsor, Global Tourism Economy Forum, our official debate topic partner for tomorrow, Airbnb, our session sponsor. They're sponsoring session 4 later today, 2031, and of course, our sponsor, iFree Group. So our next session begins in about 10 minutes. So that will be at 2:10. So that's 2:10 Bangkok time. So it's around just about 12 minutes from now. It's session 2, Reconnect. Reconnecting Tourism. The session is organized in collaboration with Web and Travel Middle East. It is a fantastic session with some great speakers. We have the CEO and founder of WeGo, the CEO of Agoda, and the CEO of TripAdvisor. And of course, that is moderated by the founder and editor at Web and Travel, Yu Siu Hoon. So please do join us. To actually be able to join that session, this will not continue, this will end, but then you have to click on the program and then join session 2, Reconnect. So, once the session ends, this will go blank, and then to go to the next session, just go to the program, click session 2 once it starts at 2:10, and I'll see you then. And with that, if you have any questions about this session or any of the sessions today or anything about PATA, please do email me at paul@pata.org. Once again, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and I will see you at the next session. Take care and see you then.